Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Daytimer Speaker Series event with Dr. Gloria Harris. Dr. Harris earned her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Washington and co-authored Assertive Training for Women, Surviving Infidelity, Women Trailblazers of California, and Remarkable Jewish Women of San Diego, which is a lecture that I hope we can present later in the summer. Dr. Harris has served on a number of boards and commissions throughout California, including the Women's Museum of California, and she was named Mental Health America's Volunteer of the Year and inducted into the San Diego Women's Hall of Fame. The Women Trailblazers of California lecture you'll hear today will travel through California's history of remarkable women that have been at the core of change and innovation. You'll learn about these women throughout today's lecture, and these inspiring stories cover 20 of the remarkable women, but the book actually covers double that amount, and you'll be able to learn more about those other women. We encourage you all to pick up the book. It's available on Amazon and through other sources, and we'll learn more about that momentarily. Without further ado, Dr. Gloria Harris.
Thank you. Just as a brief introduction, adding to the kind introduction Eileen gave me, is just to say how I came to write the book. As you heard, in 2010, I was inducted into the San Diego Women's Hall of Fame and invited to join the board of what was then called the Women's History Museum. It was located in Golden Hill. So I thought, well, if I'm going to be on a board, I should know something about women's history, shouldn't I? And I did quite a lot of research and discovered that no one had ever pulled together a collection identifying the contributions of women to the state of California. So I figured somebody's got to do it, I'll do it. And that's how the book came to be, and it is co-authored. I'm the first author, and my co-author is Hannah Combe, who at the time was chair of the board of the Women's Museum of California. So I will proceed. As Eileen said, the book has 40 women in it, but in an hour I can only do 20. So I'm selecting 2 from each section. And there's the cover. I'll raise my hand, which means next slide, if Eileen sees it. The 1848 discovery of gold in the American River in Northern California forever changed the state's history. When news of gold spread around the world, thousands of prospectors, dreaming they would strike it rich, traveled west. There we go. In 1841, the citizens of Missouri received a letter from a former resident praising California. It described, quote, a wonderful fertile land with a sublime climate, meek Indians, and a lax local government. As a result, Nancy Kelsey, pictured here, her husband and their infant daughter joined a group bound for the West Coast. For the first 1,200 miles, all went well. But when they reached Wyoming, problems began. After a young man was captured by Indians, some members of the group decided to take a safer route and headed to Oregon. By September, their situation became desperate. The weather got colder, food grew scarce, and the oxen became too exhausted to pull their wagons. One by one, the cattle were killed for food, and the wagons had to be abandoned. After 7 long months, the weary group arrived at Sutter's Fort near the present-day city of Sacramento. Nancy Kelsey became the first white woman to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, and miraculously, her baby also survived the journey. After gold was discovered, Lucina Wilson's husband told his wife, and the mother of their two small children, he planned to head to California, and he would send for her later. An independent woman, she insisted on accompanying him. In 1849, after a 2,200-mile journey by wagon, the family arrived in Sacramento. One evening, while she was cooking supper over a campfire, a hungry man approached and offered her $5 for a biscuit. Lucina hesitated, and he repeated his offer to purchase and said that he would give $10 for bread made by a woman. The man's second offer was accepted. As a result of her profitable biscuit sale, Lucina put her culinary skills to work. She cooked meals for as many as 20 miners at a time. Each man, as he rose, put $1 in my hand and said I might count on him as a permanent customer, she recalled. Lucina saved all the money she earned and convinced her husband to invest in several small hotels that became profitable. Lucina Wilson, a pioneering woman, became a successful entrepreneur. After the hardship of their journey, everyone was grateful to finally arrive in California. Only a few lucky families were able to move into cabins. In the gold mining camps, their first homes were likely to be tents or shacks with dirt floors. Next. Louise Clapp married a man who was a medical student. In 1851, they moved to Marysville, located in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where a dusty gold mining camp, which is pictured, had been established. More than 2,000 miners, 4 women, and a few children lived in the crowded community. Since the camp had only one doctor, her husband planned to practice medicine there. Without newspapers, theaters, or female companionship, the miners' only entertainment was an abundance of whiskey and the lure of gold. Louise wrote letters to her sister in Massachusetts describing camp life. She wrote, "We have had murders, fearful accidents, bloody deaths, whippings, a hanging, and a fatal duel. I almost shrink from relating the gloomy news, but I leave out the darker shades of our mountain life. The picture then would be incomplete." Louise Clapp's letters, subsequently published under the name Dame Shirley, are among the best records of day-to-day life in a mining camp from a woman's perspective. Next. Biddy Mason was a slave on a Mississippi plantation. She had 3 daughters, reputedly fathered by her owner, Robert Smith. In 1847, Smith became a Mormon convert and moved to Utah with his slaves. In this 2,000-mile cross-country journey, Biddy was responsible for herding the cattle, preparing meals, caring for her children, and serving as a midwife. In 1851, Smith moved his household to join another Mormon community in San Bernardino, California. He was unaware that California was a free state where slavery was against the law. After her emancipation, Biddy moved to Los Angeles and found employment as a nurse and midwife. Biddy was very frugal, and 10 years later, she bought a small house on Spring Street for $250. At the time, the property was considered out of town, but it eventually became part of the city's central financial district. In 1884, she sold a parcel of the land for $1,500. As Los Angeles boomed, Biddy continued to make profitable real estate transactions until she accumulated about $300,000, a small fortune at the time. As Biddy became wealthy, she donated money to numerous charities and became a widely recognized Los Angeles philanthropist. Next. The battle for women's suffrage had been waging for decades. As early as 1870, a group of pioneer suffragists demanded voting equality. It was not, however, until 1911 that California women achieved suffrage, and not until 1920, 100 years ago to this year, with the passage of the 19th Amendment, that all women were granted the right to vote. Ellen Clark Sargent made her mark in the long fight for women's suffrage. She served as president of California's Equal Suffrage Association 7 times. Ellen and her husband, Aaron Sargent, a United States senator, spoke openly about their support for women's rights. In 1878, he introduced the 29 words that would eventually become the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The amendment was reintroduced into Congress every year for over 40 years until it was finally ratified in 1920. In 1901, Ellen sued San Francisco to recover property taxes she had paid as a protest in favor of women's suffrage. Ellen was represented in court by her son, George, a practicing lawyer. Borrowing a slogan from the Revolutionary War, they argued that taxation without representation was unjust. They used this historical reference to prove that without the vote, women should not be required to pay taxes. Although they lost their case, the tax protest movement made an important statement about women's suffrage. Just before midnight, on April 1st, 1878, Clara Shortridge Foltz bolted into the California governor's chambers. She could not accept the news that the Women Lawyers Bill legislation entitling women to practice law was dead. But as Clara's account goes, the governor listened to her appeal, then retrieved the bill from a discard pile, and just moments before the midnight deadline, he signed it into law. The historic moment was just one of many in Clara's career as the first woman lawyer on the Pacific Coast. She sued for entrance into Hastings, California's only law school, tried cases in court when women were not allowed to serve on juries, and played a key role in winning women's suffrage in California. As you may have heard, California was the 6th state to grant women the right to vote in 1911. The next two women profiled made significant contributions to California with their courage, tenacity, and concern for the rights of others. In 1933, Rose Pisota, a Jewish immigrant and member of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, arrived in Los Angeles to organize union shops. As a growing garment center, the Los Angeles industry employed 7,500 workers. Rose learned that the manufacturers preferred Latinos to white or black women because they would work for a pittance and endure any sort of treatment. When the dressmakers attempted to unionize, they were fired and blacklisted. Outraged at the bigoted views of the male leaders, Rose organized the campaign. In order to accomplish her goal, Rose visited women workers in their homes, set up social gatherings, and arranged for a daily Spanish language broadcast on a local radio station. The dressmakers held a meeting to set their demands, which included union recognition, a 35-hour week, and a minimum wage. After employers ignored their demands, 4,000 workers walked off their jobs. Nearly a month later, the strike ended with an arbitrated settlement. Rose Pisota became known as one of the most effective union organizers in the United States. Dolores Huerta spent most of her life fighting for better working conditions for farm workers. Unfortunately, her role in the farm workers movement has been overshadowed by that of Cesar Chavez, her longtime collaborator and co-founder of what became the United Farm Workers of America. Dolores met Chavez in 1955. She helped organize the 1965 strike of 5,000 grape workers and was the lead negotiator in the workers' contract that followed. Dolores organized workers and advocated for safe working conditions, including the elimination of harmful pesticides. In the 1970s, she coordinated a national lettuce boycott, and she supported passage of the 1975 Agricultural Labor Relations Act, the first law to recognize the rights of farm workers to bargain collectively. Decades before the first Earth Day in 1970, women were on the forefront to protect the environment. The next two California women are recognized for devoting their lives to save some small part of the planet. Distraught after fire destroyed the grand redwood trees that surrounded her ranch, Josephine Mccracken wrote that the worst enemy of the redwoods was not fire, but greed and vandalism that would hack, cut, and mutilate the grandest, most magnificent forest that can be found on the face of the globe. It was this terrifying fire in 1899 that sparked a movement committed to saving these trees. And she became known as the savior of the redwoods. Josephine's conservationist work was not limited to the giants of the forest. In 1901, upset with the mass destruction of songbirds, she founded the first Bird Protection Society of California. When Minerva Hoyt moved to Southern California in 1897, she was taken with its desert landscape and went on a quest to protect it. She organized the International Deserts Conservation League with the intention of creating a desert park. Minerva had two goals. First, there was the need to protect desert plants and animals. And equally important was the value of the desert as a retreat, which she described in terms of its calm and silence. She successfully lobbied the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s to preserve the area as a national monument. Minerva Hoyt earned international recognition for founding Joshua Tree National Park, the only place in the world where these trees stand. Women were not allowed to study medicine in California as long as the medical schools were privately owned. And it was not until the Toland Medical College became part of the University of California in 1874 that women were accepted. Lucy Windsor applied to medical school in San Francisco in 1873, but was rejected. She finally was admitted after an appeal. To appreciate Lucy's spirit and determination, consider the retort she gave to a professor who told her the field of medicine was no place for a woman to work. And if she does, she ought to have her ovaries removed. To which Lucy responded, if that is true, the men students ought also to have their testicles removed. In 1876, Lucy graduated from the University of California Medical School with honors. After graduation, Lucy was admitted to the San Francisco County Medical Society, but only after threats to blackball her failed. She specialized in gynecology and obstetrics and was also a founding member of the San Francisco Children's Hospital, the first hospital built to care for women and children. Jude Mccracken received her medical degree in 1888. After marrying, she and her husband moved to California, where they settled in Indio, a sparsely populated part of the state. Her reputation as a skilled physician attracted the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it appointed her as the first white doctor responsible for thousands of Cahuilla Indians living on 5 tribal reservations. In 1917, after visiting a patient driving home in her Model T Ford, a large truck forced her off the road. This was not June's first experience of narrow escapes. On a later trip, she noticed a ridge in the middle of the highway that indicated on which side of the road drivers should stay. Thus was born her idea of a painted stripe down the middle of the road to prevent accidents. She presented her idea to several government agencies, but was rebuffed. However, June knew how to win a fight. In her long dress, she got down on her knees and, using baking flour, painted a 4-inch wide stripe down the middle of US Highway 99 to create 2 separate lanes. Dr. Jude Mccracken is credited with inventing the first striped lines that run down the center of all our roads, prevent thousands of accidents, and save an untold number of lives. Up until the late 19th century, the law was solely a man's world. After graduating from the University of Southern California's law school in 1914, Georgia Bullock served as a referee for the Los Angeles Women's Court, reserved exclusively for women's cases. A magazine article explained, "Women and girls who have committed crimes and those who are suspected of having committed crimes will bare their hearts not to a courtroom full of curious, leering men, but to a few women who understand." Georgia later became a woman's court judge, and in 1926 she became a municipal judge, despite having received death threats for her appointment. Georgia held court sessions daily. In 1931, she was appointed by the governor to serve as judge of the California Superior Court, the first woman judge of the Superior Court. Georgia Bullock retired in 1955, having served on the Los Angeles Supreme Court for 25 years. Some of you may recognize this woman. After earning her law degree in 1965, Rose Byrd applied to the Sacramento Public Defender's Office, but was told that it did not hire women. Her interviewer explained that he had only known one good female trial attorney, and she turned out to be an alcoholic. Rose eventually was hired by the Santa Clara County Public Defender's Office. In 1974, she volunteered on Jerry Brown's gubernatorial campaign and served as his driver. Following his election, he appointed her as Secretary of Agriculture, and she became the first woman to hold a cabinet position in California. In 1977, Governor Brown appointed Rose to serve as the first female justice on the California Supreme Court, and she later became the court's Chief Justice. In 1986, Rose faced re-election and was vigorously attacked because of her opposition to the death penalty. Anti-Byrd groups described brutal crimes, claiming that, quote, Byrd let the killers go free, unquote. The campaign to unseat her succeeded, and Rose Byrd became the first Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court to be removed from office by a majority of the state's voters. Early California settlers did not recognize the importance of being able to read and write. Olive Man Isbell, who taught while the Mexican-American War raged on around her, was California's first teacher. Next. This is Olive Man Isbell. In 1846, she and her husband joined a group of wagon trains heading west. After a hazardous overland journey, the pioneers struggled into Santa Clara County, where they were escorted to the mission. The Mexican army was trying to reclaim its land, and the mission was on the verge of being attacked. Americans barricaded inside the crumbling mission were terrified. Amidst the climate of fear, Olive saw that the children needed to be constructively occupied, and she thought of the answer, a school. Olive built a rickety table and a few benches from scraps of wood. Before you get started, you'll have to learn how to use this, she was told, as one of the men handed her a long rifle. When classes began, she kept the weapon handy. Lacking even pencils and paper, Olive taught lessons on the dirt floor with a long pointed stick and wrote the alphabet on the palms of her pupils' hands with charcoal. And thus began the first school in California taught by a woman. Marilyn Boxer served as chair of the nation's first Women's Studies program, established at San Diego State University in 1970. Recently divorced, and at the age of 40, she began her doctoral studies at the University of Riverside. While still a graduate student, Marilyn taught her first course as a women's history instructor at a local community college. According to Marilyn, quote, women's history is not just a form of social history to be dismissed as the history of trivial things, such as how people dressed or furnished their houses. It is political history and fundamental to the major issues with which historians traditionally have been concerned. After completing her doctorate in 1974, she was hired by San Diego State University and appointed as chair of its interdisciplinary women's studies program. When I found the information about Marilyn Boxer, I knew that Barbara Boxer was Jewish, and I wrote to Marilyn. I had been a professor of women's studies in the 80s, and I knew her. She wrote back to me and said, yes, she was Jewish. She was involved at San Diego State in Jewish activities and attended temple. She had moved to San Francisco after retirement. And she's now 90. And she was planning, I understand, to come back to San Diego State to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Women's Studies program. Unfortunately, as we all know, we were all isolated in April, so she was unable to attend. But she still is interested in women's history and women's issues at the age of 90. California has a rich history of diverse architectural landscape and design styles. This sketch is of a residence by Lillian Rice, who designed many of the homes in Rancho Santa Fe. Prior to the early 20th century, it was the rare woman who dreamed of designing residences, commercial buildings, and public gardens. The next woman I'm going to talk about is Julia Morgan. Julia Morgan built a sterling reputation with projects known around the world. Unfortunately, my co-author and I were unable to obtain a picture of her because her family does not allow her picture to be reprinted. So this is a picture of a building that she designed in San Francisco. Born in San Francisco in 1872, Julia attended the University of California, Berkeley, where she studied civil engineering. In her senior year, she met Bernard Maybeck, a charismatic teacher who recognized her exceptional talent and encouraged her to study architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Julia became the first woman to graduate from what was at that time the world's most prestigious architectural school. After returning to the Bay Area in 1902, she soon established an independent practice. During the 50 years of her long and brilliant career, Julia designed over 700 structures, including the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco and Hearst Castle at San Simeon, which many of you, if you are from California, may have visited. It's quite spectacular. As California's first woman architect, Julia Morgan inspired generations of young women to pursue their dreams. It is one of the most famous scenes in movie history. Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind has just been left by her husband, Rhett Butler. Lost and alone, Scarlett's thoughts turn not to another man, but to her real true love, Tara, her family's Georgia plantation. The woman who designed the shaded splendors of Tara was Florence Yoke. When she established her garden design business in 1918, Florence probably never thought she would be designing sets for some of the most memorable movies in Hollywood's history. Florence spent time in Georgia for Gone with the Wind. For The Good Earth, she transformed Los Angeles' San Fernando Valley into rice fields. And in How Green Was My Valley, she made 10,000 daffodils bloom. Florence Yoke was one of the most successful American landscape architects of the 20th century. From the early gold rush era to the present day, entertainment was a venue for women to shine. In the early 20th century, filmmaking as an industry began to flourish, and female actors played a critical role. Although women did whatever it took to get their names in lights, sexism was a dominant feature in the film industry. In spite of this environment, Dorothy Arthur became a film director who made history by directing Paramount's first sound movie, Manhattan Cocktail. During her career, she made a smooth transition from directing 3 silent movies to 14 talkies. And from 1927 until her retirement from directing in 1943, Dorothy was the only female director working in Hollywood. She was the first woman to direct a sound film and the first woman to join the Directors Guild of America. Additionally, Dorothy Arthur launched the careers of a number of Hollywood actresses, including Katharine Hepburn, Rosalind Russell, and Lucille Ball. Mary Pickford was a talented actor, a creative producer, and a savvy businesswoman who helped shape the film industry. Mary was known as the girl with curls before audiences learned her name. Between 1912 and 1919, she jumped between a variety of studios until she risked it all, joining with Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin to form United Artists. Mary would risk her career again when she told her adoring public, "Instead of being America's sweetheart, I want to be one man's sweetheart." At a time when stars were told they could not be divorced and still be a big box office hit, Mary divorced and married Douglas Fairbanks in 1920. Their marriage was hailed as the Marriage of the Century. Mary Pickford, one of the most successful actresses of all time, won an Academy Award for her first talkie, Coquette, and went on to receive an honorary Oscar for her contribution to motion pictures in 1976. As a testimony to her impact on the film industry, there is a picture of her with her famous ringlets hanging in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And that concludes my formal presentation. I'll make a few concluding comments. The book is now available at the Women's Museum of California, which moved from its former site in Golden Hill to Liberty Station. And I hope some of you will have an opportunity, once we stop being socially isolated, to visit the museum. Also, it may interest you to know that the book, Women Trailblazers of California, has its most sales in Sacramento at the bookstore underneath the Capitol building. Also, I did get a little plug from Eileen in the building. If you got interested in the stories and want to read about the other 20 women who were included, the book has 40 as a total. Again, I checked the price on Amazon. The book retails for 20, but Amazon has it for 14, which is a bargain. Anyway, I don't know if Eileen wants to use the last couple of minutes for questions, or if we should just say farewell and thank you for joining.
I think there's definitely, I know I, on my phone next to me, was Googling about Dr. Jude Mccracken, learning about the lines in the road. That was, I mean, everything was fascinating, but that really caught me as something cool. And can you tell us a little bit more? I know we don't have time for our formal Q&A, but how you found the women. I know you explained a couple along the way, but I think that's something that's, I know that's a question that will likely come up. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the more obscure ones and how you found those?
Well, the one you mentioned is an interesting story, Jude Mccracken. My husband and I were at the opera. Probably, well, the book was written in 1911, 2011, of course. And we were talking about, I'm looking to identify women that belong in the book. A man seated in front of us in the opera turns around and he said, "I work for Caltrans. Have you ever heard of Jude Mccracken?" "No, who is she?" And he told me the story. And of course, she's an interesting person and we put her in the book. Sima Oppenheimer and I are residents of Wesley Palms senior community. And in order to move from my 3,000 square foot house in La Jolla to my 1,400 two-bedroom patio home in Wesley Palms, I had to downsize significantly. So part of the answer is I had an entire bookcase filled with women's history books. Many of them had to be contributed to the Women's Museum of California. But I enjoyed so much learning about some of these women, many of whom have been, Jude Mccracken as an example, unacknowledged. One of the most well-known history books about California on the back jacket says, that the book identifies and tells the stories of all the men who made significant contributions to the state of California. And I think it had 2 women in it. And there was a lot of research available on women in the gold rush. Not one single collection, as my co-author and I wrote, but there was a lot of information available about women in the gold rush. I think that occupied 2 shelves in my bookcase. But some of the other women were more difficult to identify. And it just took a great deal of research. Ordering books off of Amazon. I had one book that was published in 1905. That was fun, but that's the answer, just painful research, because after the gold rush, there were very few women who had been acknowledged as making significant contributions to the social and cultural history of San Diego and of California. By the way, I mentioned San Diego because that was the other book. Most of these women are from Northern California or Los Angeles who made significant contributions to California. And because of the relative success of the book, the publisher invited my co-author and I to write the second book, Remarkable Women of San Diego. So I hope that answers.
I look forward to hosting that lecture with you soon. I think that would be fantastic. And just thank you so much for this well-presented information. This was so fascinating. I will end our recording now, and we can open up the room for people to chat and say hellos and goodbyes. Thank you again.